special fishbowl. My name's Dave McKenna, and today we're holding a scrutiny meetup and inviting 3 clerks from different parliamentary scrutiny setups to share their experiences and their secrets, we hope. It's in 2 parts. First, we invite our fishes to have an informal chat for about 20 minutes or so. We then take a quick break and ask the meetup participants to come up with their questions that the fishes work through in part 2. So let me introduce our fishes before I disappear and let them get on with it. First of all, we have Faye Bowen from Welsh Parliament, who's the clerk to the Public Accounts Committee and a meetup veteran, I should say. Hello, Faye.
Hi, Dave. Hi, everybody.
Next, we have Matthew Congreve from the House of Commons, who's the second clerk to the Defence Committee. Hello, Matthew.
Hi, Dave. Thank you for having me.
Lovely to have you here. And then finally, Francisca Gale from the Tynwald, the Parliament of the Isle of Man. And Francisca is the Deputy Head of the Chamber and Information Service and Clerk to the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee. Hello, Francisca.
Hello.
Hello all. Excellent. So I would just like to invite you for the next 20 minutes or so to have a chat about what it is that help you do or others in your team do that helps the committee members to sing in their scrutiny work. What kind of practical tips and advice do you have, and what challenges do you have also? So I'm just going to invite you to start the chat. I'm going to leave you now and I'll come back in about 20 or so minutes. So looking forward to hearing your discussion.
Okay, so how should we begin?
Well, I was going to start at the beginning, actually, and we've just had our elections in the Welsh Parliament, and we're going to be looking at ways to support members perhaps differently for this next Senedd term. And I think one of the really important things to help your committee sing is having a really clear understanding from the outset about what members' preferences are and how to best, what tools are the best ones to give them to help them do their job. We do that by, speaking to them and just finding out a bit more about what sort of briefing material they need, what sort of, how they want their papers given to them. And some of that even is the basic logistics, whether it's hard copy or in this virtual world, making sure they have the technology to be able to access meetings and what their preferred form of communication is. So I think that would be a good place to start, is just speaking to your members and just getting an understanding of what they need to do the job.
Yeah, I completely agree, Faye. I think this has been a challenge for us in the House of Commons over the past year with coronavirus. So that came quite quickly after the last general election. And so we weren't given much of an opportunity to meet our membership face to face and understand their preferences and how they want to be best supported by us. Usually, that sort of informal conversations that we have with our members happen when we see them face to face for our meetings. We've been meeting virtually or hybrid for the last year or so, or when we go on visits across the world or across the UK. And again, those have been curtailed by COVID. But I think, understanding what members want and how we can best serve that is obviously crucial to probably almost everyone's job on this call today. And for example, one of the things that I think has actually really helped our committee sing has been to actually have those conversations and to change the way that we're briefing and suggesting questions for members. So simple little practical things like, for example, we used to just produce a quite hefty written brief for members. They could go upwards to 100 pages if we were looking at something really technical. We've now tried to reduce that, but we've also aimed to complement that with a video brief. So we create a PowerPoint where the responsible member of staff for that brief speaks over the PowerPoint and summarizes it in about 10 minutes. We then put that on a WhatsApp group, which all the members are in. And rather than them having to spend their Sunday afternoon trawling through the brief, which I hope they still do to more or less, but they now have the opportunity to watch this 10-minute video brief instead, which can summarize the key issues for them. So really listening to what members want and understanding, it's the same with councillors and with members in the Senedd and the Tynwald and in the House of Commons and other parliaments. Time is their most precious resource. So where can we add value and how can we signpost and make things the most easy for them to do their important job of scrutinising, in our case, the MOD, but various government branches of government and councils across the UK.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's really all about building relationships with the members and learning what they like, how they like their information to be presented. You know, what their areas of particular interest are, what do they know about already? Because if they are already, you know, if they already know way more than you about a particular topic, then, you know, you don't need to put as much work into putting together a briefing paper or even questions quite often as well. I'd be quite interested in knowing how you go about formulating questions actually for oral evidence hearings, because well, I mean, I think it depends quite a bit on the individual clerk and obviously on the committee as well, but we can go from sort of literally just producing a list of topics that they might want to raise during the oral hearing, or to, you know, very precise questions with even including, you know, sort of opening formula and that kind of thing, which I think is a bit excessive. I think there's somewhere probably to be met in the middle to be found there. So quite interested in hearing how you go about that, both of you.
I think that's probably one of the toughest challenges to crack, to be honest. I've been a clerk for a really long time, and the one thing we still don't seem to get right is how we brief members. You know, I think sometimes, as Matthew was just saying, they can be excessively long, and with the best will in the world, I think we want to do the best job and give members all the information. But if we've only got an hour and a half to meet, you're not going to get through all those questions. So it's more about, I think, fine-tuning the key areas of interest and, you know, keeping things quite brief so we can, you know, get to those key points during the meeting and things don't get missed. And I'm really interested actually to hear about Matthew's video briefing. That sounds really innovative and a really quick way to get members the information they need. So I think that'd be good to hear a bit more about. I think what you were saying, Francisca, is really about communication, and as members change, having that regular dialogue with them just to see what is working for them. And you know, one of the things we try and do as well is have wash-up sessions at the end of every evidence session to say, you know, was the brief okay? Did it help? Is there things we can do differently? You know, do we get the right areas of interest for you? So I think that's really important too.
Yeah, suggested questions, I think, has always been a challenge and probably will always be a challenge for committees. You can never do it perfect 100% of the time. One of the things that we found really useful actually is, first of all, kind of, it's quite clear that most people will probably do this, but it's a really important thing to do, is to tie, you know, the specific questions that you've made to the brief. So, you know, we'll have question 1, and then in brackets after the question it'll say, you know, this is covered in pages 3 to 10 of the brief, so that if a member, you know, knows they want that question but haven't had time to read the entire brief, they can quickly go to the relevant section and pick up the relevant facts and figures. But yeah, I find it really difficult to know the balance for questions, because as always in scrutiny, the killer question is the follow-up question to the answer that's just been given. And when you're a scrutiny officer, you don't know what answer is going to be given. I mean, sometimes you do. You can predict quite easily sometimes what the government's going to say when they come before you, and therefore you can get a good follow-up question. But a lot of the time you can't, and therefore it's really down to members. So it's just, yeah, giving the information that we can in the brief, and signposting to make it as easily understandable for members as they can. On the video brief, so this was something that we've really introduced post coronavirus, really, because prior to this, we would have the member of staff who's responsible for the brief stand up in the private meeting before going live and having the witnesses before us, who would then explain about the brief and you know, spend a couple of minutes saying, you know, this is an area I think members might be interested in, this is a key question. Because we were lacking that, we had a period of having completely virtual meetings, and then we had a period now, which we're in, where we're having hybrid meetings where only 1 or 2 members of staff are in. We introduced this video brief, which, like I said, is about 10 minutes, and it's the member of staff with a PowerPoint talking over, you know, the background, key areas of the brief, and then going through each of the suggested questions in turn and justifying why we've decided to put it in there. Something that we found really useful for suggested questions as well is to actually have a mini circulation a couple of days prior to the main circulation, where we say, these are the questions we think members might be interested in. could you give us a bit of feedback on these in advance of our final circulation, so that if you want, you know, more on topic X versus topic Y, let us know, and then we'll reshuffle the brief before our main documents go out on Thursday afternoons.
That sounds like a good idea as well.
Yeah, getting lots of good tips today. I think this probably sounds extremely basic, but having a proper remit and terms of reference for the inquiry that you're looking at is really helpful, I think, at least from the officer's perspective, because our committees, so we have a system of select and standing committees, and by select we mean ad hoc committees, and they tend to have quite good terms of reference because they're usually referred from Tynwald, or they are referred from Tynwald, and so at some point someone will have sat down and thought up what this select committee is going to do. But the standing committees tend to come up with an idea, terribly enthusiastic, it'll be, oh yes, we must do this, and then they start asking questions, sending for evidence, and by the time, you know, you're 3 months through and it's what are we actually looking at, which can be a bit of a challenge sometimes. I mean, maybe that's a particular problem for us, I don't know. We probably need to be more firm in getting committees to actually decide what they're going to look at from the outset, but I don't know if anyone has any experience with that as well.
I would say that the way that select committees in the House tend to do things sounds similar to how your standing committees operate, in terms of, you know, there'll be a private meeting where the committee will just say, you know, we're interested in X, Y, and Z. These are broadly the questions we think are interesting within that. Let's get some written evidence in, and then we'll proceed with the inquiry later in the year. And for us, actually, it's sometimes quite difficult to get that right, and I'd appreciate Faye's input on this as well, because by the time you've actually received the written evidence you've called for, the questions which you think are most important have probably changed at that point, and so maybe half the evidence you've received is no longer as useful as it potentially could have been had you known more 2-3 months prior when you put those questions out. So learning a little bit more about how you both generate those terms of reference and whether there are any specific things you do there would be really useful from my perspective.
Yeah, I think that's another big challenge, isn't it? I mean, my work on Public Accounts Committee is probably a little bit different because we've got a very tight remit, and our work tends to be coming from Auditor General reports, but we have started to do more committee-led work, which is on a par with other select committee type of work. And I think it's just really crucial from the outset. You have to have a really frank conversation with your members about what is it you want to get out of this inquiry, and have a whole meeting just on scoping out the work. Otherwise, down the line, you get to a point where, as you say, you've got all this evidence coming in, and it's sort of just gone all over the place, and you're not actually getting anywhere. So I think having that conversation or meeting at the outset, and perhaps reviewing it a little way into the inquiry just to see that we're keeping things on track, and is this actually delivering what your members wanted to achieve. I guess in an ideal world, you'd try and do some written consultation before you set your terms of reference, and we have got some experience on difficult inquiries where we've involved stakeholders in the scoping process, and that's really helped us define our terms of reference and make sure we're hitting, you know, the key areas. But again, that is that's time consuming, and if it's a more reactive inquiry, that's not always going to work. But they are some of the approaches we've taken to address some of those problems.
Faye, one thing I was really interested in hearing about from your experience on the Public Accounts Committee is how you engage in financial scrutiny. So it's something that we, as kind of departmental select committees in the House of Commons, I think quite struggle with, because we get annual reports and accounts from our relevant departments, but we don't necessarily, as staff perhaps, and not throwing any shade at any of my fantastically talented colleagues, don't have the level of financial literacy and scrutiny abilities to really decipher the numbers and pick out what's important. So if there's anything there you could share with us about how to really strongly engage in financial scrutiny, that'd be really useful.
Yeah, it's another challenging area, isn't it? And we do annual scrutiny of the accounts, primarily Welsh Government's accounts and our own Senedd accounts. We always look at ourselves as well, and then alongside a selection of other publicly funded bodies on a sort of cyclical basis. But we're really fortunate. We've got a financial scrutiny team in our research service, which I think would be like your House of Commons financial scrutiny unit, and they've got the expertise that we need to do that work. So in terms of briefing, we have extra briefings for members to help them, just be able to look at a set of accounts and be able to understand it, because it's really daunting. And it's one of the first things our new committee will do in the autumn. So we'll do lots of preparation for that. We'll have some sessions just sort of briefing them on what to look for in the accounts, how the accounts are laid out, and where they're telling a story, I suppose. And in the past, we've had some external training from SIPFA on that as well, just to help members, with that work. So yeah, that'd be my key tips. Get some other experts in to give you a hand.
How easy do you find it to motivate? I suppose members who are motivated to be on the Public Accounts Committee probably already have that motivation to engage in financial scrutiny. But for members who are on perhaps other committees with more of a policy remit, they might not be as interested in those raw numbers as they perhaps could be. Do you have any advice about how you can transfer that enthusiasm which your financial scrutiny officers might have to the members of committees, so that they can really pick apart the numbers that government or other bodies has presented to them?
I think it's really about highlighting examples where the figures have revealed something. Certainly from what I've learned, I didn't come into this all enthusiastic at the start, looking at a set of accounts, you think, it's just numbers. But working with our colleagues, it's the story behind those accounts, and they can point you to something that will say, you want to ask a question about this particular figure because this is going to highlight some poor governance around, perhaps procurement, which has led to a massive loss. So it's highlighting that story that can be told and how those figures lead to revealing, perhaps poor practice or areas of improvement, and that you can make a difference by doing this work. I suppose that's the only thing I can say, really. It is a dry subject, and I know we struggle with our finance committee as well, and trying to get people enthusiastic about fiscal devolution, for example. It's really important and it's exciting, but it's trying to translate that into something perhaps more tangible, that by looking at these figures, this is what your output could be. And I've actually kept a collection of news headlines from our account scrutiny work where we flagged up some misgivings in the way things have been handled. And I think I probably roll that out when I'm trying to enthuse people about looking at the figures, just to say these are the things we found out by doing this work, and if we hadn't, we wouldn't have known, and it wouldn't have led to improvement, and more money would have been wasted. So I think that would be my advice.
That's really useful, thank you.
Yeah, that raises quite an interesting question about how you measure your committee's effectiveness. Do any of you have any sort of actual formal ways of doing that, or is it more just seeing what gets picked up by the media and what seems to influence government policy, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, because there's a common criticism of how select committees, at least in the House of Commons, work, in that we'll do a huge inquiry, we'll take loads of raw evidence, we'll write more often than not a really well drafted and well reasoned report, and then it gets sent to the government. The government should respond within 2 months, sometimes take a little bit longer. We get the government response, and then that's it, done, until the committee wants to look at it again at an unknown time in the future, if ever. So there's two questions there. It's, how do we keep up scrutiny of really important areas after we finish doing inquiry? But then answering your question, how do we actually measure what impact we've had if we're not continuing to look at these issues as they move forward? I know that colleagues on the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, and perhaps Faye in the Senedd, this is the same as well, have actually a really good spreadsheet of all the report recommendations they've made, and then tracking whether they're actually implemented or not. It's not something we've actually introduced on our committee, and I think measuring our effectiveness and our success by to what extent the government accept our recommendations is probably not the best metric by which we can measure what we do, because sometimes by its very nature, the government might be a little bit reluctant to take on board what the committee have said, because it can be seen as a criticism and can be seen as them, backing down and changing their ways, rather than perhaps a more productive approach, which would be, this is a way that we can improve our policy. So yeah, looking at how we've impacted the media, looking at those news stories of how we've highlighted things that perhaps weren't known about before. But it's an interesting question, because to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure we are the best at making sure that we're actually assessing what impact we're doing. It's almost as if once we've done the body of work, it's like, right, let's move on to the next inquiry now, rather than how can we keep pressure, how can we measure what impact or change we're making here.
I was smiling there because we've just, I wouldn't say stolen, but we've certainly plagiarised the Commons Pack spreadsheet. It was an excellent spreadsheet. So we're going to use that going forward now into the next Senedd, just to help us keep track of recommendations. And we do regularly revisit recommendations. But I think you're right, Francisco, it's a very difficult thing to measure, isn't it? And I don't think we have any formal way of doing it. And it's hard to measure sort of what we call the deterrent effect, I suppose, that the very nature of having these committees does that keep the executive on its toes, and they're doing things better just because we exist? And how would it be if we didn't? And there's just no way of measuring that. But I mean, we tend to keep a look at what feedback we get from Welsh Government, and where they've made changes as a result of our recommendation. We log those. Sort of, that's one way of measuring our effectiveness, where things have changed and we've led to improvement. Yeah, I think there's a lot of academic research ongoing on this as well, and there's just no straight answer. And what's your experience in the Isle of Man?
Yeah, so it is a bit of one of those questions that you can't really answer, isn't it? So we do have a way of monitoring whether the government implement recommendations. It's called the Tynwald Policy Decisions List, which is actually maintained by the government. So every year they have to report to Tynwald on what they've done with the committee recommendations that have been approved. But as you say, it is quite interesting. So with my committee, I know that quite a few of their recommendations have been voted down by Tynwald and by the government. But ultimately, actually, quite a lot of the things that they've recommended have been implemented. It's just that, as Matthew was saying at the time, the government didn't really want to be shown to be agreeing with the committee. So yeah, it's how you capture that kind of outcome of the committee's work as well, which is, as you say, probably more a question for academics really ultimately. But
yeah, I think that's really interesting. Something that we found as well is that kind of silent policy change 3 months after the committee's report has come out. In the government response, it will say, "Oh, we've taken on board all these opinions as expressed, but we're going to keep things as they are." And then you notice next month this quiet change in policy, which is exactly what the committee's recommended. And I think on the topic of sorry, Dave, I know I'm speaking over now. On the topic of academic research into this, there was some fascinating research about that exact effect. It's this kind of, although the recommendation hasn't been accepted by the government, how many recommendations are actually taken in place a year later, and the number is a lot higher. So yeah, in some ways quite a positive for how committees can be effective, actually, I think.
Yeah, great stuff. I mean, I just appeared because I heard the word academic, so I thought that would be the right moment for me just to pop up. Brilliant conversation. You've been going really well for over 20 minutes, so I think it's only right that we give you a break. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to invite everybody into rooms and to discuss what stood out. What would you like to ask the fishes? Because when you come back from your rooms, I'm going to invite you to put your questions in the chat. I think it's been a really rich and interesting conversation so far. I've made a list. I won't share it because I don't want to preempt what you talk about in your groups. But they're groups of 4 or 5, and I'm going to give you 10 minutes. So have 10 minutes, have a discussion about what stood out, see if there's any questions that you'd like to ask the fishes. Meanwhile, you 3, I'm going to put you in the green room As I said, there's Prosecco, there's Pringles, there's Cocoa, and there's Cornettos, depending on where you are and how you're feeling. So we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes. Okay, so we've all just had a quick break when all the participants in the meetup have had a chance to think of some questions for the fishes, which they've put into the chat. And I'm now going to invite the fishes for the next 10 or 15 minutes just to work through the questions in the chat as best they can, just picking out any that they're interested in and having a conversation on the back of that. So if you're ready to go, fishes, I'm just going to drop out and I'll see you in 10 or 15 minutes. Excellent, go for it.
Shall we just start at the top and work our way down? Does that seem sensible to you all? Okay. So I think the first one on my screen list is from Catherine. And Faye, I think you talked about this, so it might be easiest for you to start with it. Can you give an example of a time you have involved stakeholders in the development of terms of reference and how it went?
Yeah, so I've got one that comes to mind straight away. So at the start of the last Senedd, we did a committee-led inquiry into what we call care experience children. And it was quite difficult because we're the Public Accounts Committee and that seemed very policy orientated. But the point really was around, you know, it was the money being spent on supporting children and young people in care. Was that delivering the right outcomes? Because we'd had lots of stats to suggest that that wasn't. So I think members wanted to look at it from a different angle. So that was going to be a very difficult subject area to scope out and develop terms of reference for. So we did consult with some really key stakeholders. We had a private session with them. I think we called it a roundtable discussion. So we had the Children's Commissioner there and representatives from charities and organisations that support children and young people in care, just to really help us shape the direction of the inquiry and get a first-hand idea and experience about, you know, what the key issues were, because I'll be honest with you, I don't think we knew where to start. And that went really well because they were able to speak to us really candidly in that private discussion and point us to the areas that they thought were the ones we needed to focus on. So yeah, that worked really well and it helped keep the inquiry on track. And I think, you know, the outcomes from that work were accepted by the government, and I think we're still seeing the impact of that even now. So yeah, I'll briefly cover that one.
I haven't got anything to add to that. I think we've done similar things in the past, kind of informally consulting with stakeholders prior to an inquiry launch. In some ways, it's a difficult one to balance because you don't want to give privileged access to one stakeholder group or one interest group. But if you can do kind of a roundtable like Faye's talked about and get everyone together, then it's a really good way to fill the knowledge gaps that quite often, speaking from personal experience, you as the scrutiny officer might have, given that it's a brand new topic area for you.
Yeah, I've had similar experience with committees. You've had more informal discussions with key stakeholders. Maybe not so much for a specific inquiry, but I can think of one committee once when it was newly set up. It started off by going about talking to all the relevant departments individually in private, just to get an idea of the landscape and what might be interesting to cover in the next few years. So yeah. The next one. How long in hours or days does it take to produce a brief for members? Well, I suppose it depends on what you're including in the brief, really. How long's a piece of string? I tend to find, so I also do, I manage the research services for our Parliament, and generally I find that a paper giving an overview of a subject, it takes around 15 hours to produce. I don't know, what about you, Faye and Matthew?
I think, as you say, it's hard to know. It depends on the subject area, whether or not, you know, it's a brief for an ongoing inquiry where you've already got the background material available. So the initial brief will probably take longer because it's got more of that sort of background in it. And then you build upon that with each evidence session. I think if it's a tricky area, it probably takes our researchers days. It just depends on the detail in there.
Yeah, I completely agree with the comments. I think one thing that I've reflected on, I think Faye's touched on there, is that it's a lot more difficult at the start of an inquiry because you're kind of starting from scratch, you're learning it yourself, you're finding all these external evidence sources. Once the inquiry's got going, you've got your first brief, you've got oral evidence which witnesses have given to the committee, and therefore you've got a lot more to draw on and it becomes a lot simpler. But I think 15 hours is probably a good estimate. I was going to say kind of equivalent of 2 days of work. Although for me, that'll probably be spread over longer because everyone has meetings, everyone has other things on their agendas. So yeah, but I mean, it really varies. I mean, we've had sometimes, when something really topical has come up in the news, we've arranged an evidence session for that the afternoon, the morning of. And obviously, if you're writing a brief to be for a session that's in 3 hours, you aren't going to write much of the brief other than kind of signposting members to the key news stories, the key data sets, the key government press releases or whatever, and then obviously a few suggested areas of questioning. But yeah, 15 hours is a good estimate, I would say. Oh, sorry, I should read the next question as well, shouldn't I? So Jodie, how do you ensure that the inquiry stays on task without stopping useful areas of inquiry? Yeah, I think that's a difficult question. In some ways, it depends what your remit is as a committee. For kind of departmental select committees in the House of Commons, our remit's pretty broad. So in some ways, it doesn't matter if an inquiry goes off task, because if it's something members are interested in and want to scrutinise, then that's perfectly fine. But then there can be opportunities where, the thing that's being questioned is so tangential and so unrelated to what the committee and the other, perhaps other committee members might be interested in, that it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge and a limiting factor to scrutiny. I think as a scrutiny officer, it's quite difficult because you can only control what you can control. So I mean, it's just putting relevant information in the brief. The suggested questions again, which I've talked about, keeping them as concise and on point as we can, and allowing members to then expand on them when they want to. But an inquiry, at least in my experience, is often quite a meandering journey. So like I've said at the start, we'll have terms of reference. By the time we've got halfway through that, our terms of reference might no longer be relevant because the policy's changed or whatever. I'll give an example. When 5G and Huawei's involvement in 5G was at the top of the agenda, we launched an inquiry before the government had made a decision to actually withdraw 5G Huawei equipment from 5G. So halfway through our inquiry, the raison d'etre of our inquiry was no longer there. So we had to kind of find a new reason, find new questions. So in some ways, to kind of summarize, you don't need to make sure it stays on track, but we'll do everything we can to kind of provide useful briefs and questions for members. Sorry, a very long answer. I'll let Faye and Francisca answer as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, I suppose you wouldn't want to stop useful areas of inquiry, but if things are sort of really going off piece during a meeting, we would probably do that through the chair. Because sometimes it gets to a point where you've got witnesses in who perhaps aren't prepared for that line of questioning, are not expecting it, and they're not able to answer the question. In which case you might suggest to the chair, we can follow this up in some writing after the meeting. But yeah, if it was causing an issue, I'd probably suggest the chair rein it in at that point, and we follow it up elsewhere.
Yeah, I think our responsibility is really to give members the information and the advice that they need to stay on track. But if they choose to ignore that, or their political nous tells them that something is more interesting to follow, then I think we have to respect that really and try to help them follow that up. And yeah, sometimes inquiries are going to change because something comes up that is actually more important, sort of objectively speaking. So yeah, I would agree with everything you've said. Sorry, I should go on to the next one. On the silent policy change and measuring impact, how you balance demonstrating success or impact to others without embarrassing policymakers by highlighting their U-turns and thus disincentivizing policy changes. Oh, that's a good one.
I would say we welcome them. We just welcome them. You know, we might put something out to say, or a chair statement, say we welcome this decision or announcement. It happened to us just before the end of the last Senedd. And I think, you know, something had come up in evidence, and before we did a chance to report, there was a ministerial announcement which pretty much, it almost shadowed our draft report. And of course, the government hadn't seen the report. But we had to line and say we welcomed it. And, you know, we might have said no least for 6 weeks after we looked at this, there was an announcement. But I don't think that was embarrassing. I think it was, we framed it that, look, we're working together. The government are listening. This is great. This is constructive, excellent scrutiny. And it's just something to be, everyone to celebrate. So it wasn't us and them. It was, you know, the government actively listened to us. We've done a great job, and it's led to something really good.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it depends on what angle and what motivation your members might have. So some members might see it as motivation to embarrass policymakers by highlighting their U-turns, as opposed to maybe taking that kind of collaborative approach which Faye has talked about. But yeah, similarly, we'll, you know, put out a press statement saying welcome this change, highlighting the fact that the committee might have recommended it a few months prior or had an evidence session on it. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time with UK policy, because of kind of the London media, they'll probably do more of a job on the kind of embarrassing policymakers by highlighting U-turns than we ever could as a committee. So I think we'll probably try and take a more collaborative approach, as Faye has discussed.
Yeah, and I suppose it's important to note that it's not us as officers who are embarrassing the policymakers. It's a political decision to highlight this in whatever way they wish to. So again, you know, maybe you could advise them that it might not work out very well for the committee, but if that's what they decide, then that's what they decide. What's the next one? When a recommendation is only part of the evidence to inform a decision, how can scrutiny claim it as an outcome, and how do you monitor it? Any thoughts on that?
That's a difficult one to answer, isn't it? It's part of this challenge in recommendations monitoring, I suppose. I suppose as long as you've sort of covered it in your inquiry and as part of your recommendation, I think you can put some claim to it. And yeah, highlight the role that you had in it. It's probably the best I can come up with.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it depends what role you see committees as having in some ways. Are we narrative setting? Are we therefore contributing to maybe, you know, the media discourse around a particular policy area, and therefore it's us and a number of other stakeholders all together collectively changing this policy area? Or are we a body in the common sense where we're reporting to a government department and making recommendations to them? Is that kind of the only way that we're influencing things, or are we setting a narrative more widely? I think if you agree with the more wide narrative, then you can't kind of wholly take credit for things. But I mean, I don't necessarily think committees are too motivated. In my experience, members aren't too motivated by being like, you know, we were the ones who changed this. A lot of the time, it's just we want this policy change because we think it's best. So in some ways, it doesn't matter too much where it's come from, as long as it's the outcome which hopefully the evidence suggests that you know, is the best one. So next question from Beck. How do you address lack of engagement? So I'll kick off with a few thoughts. It's quite difficult. You can only do what you can do as a scrutiny officer. So, you know, talking to maybe the member who's disengaged if they're not attending meetings, or if, you know, when they turn up, they don't seem interested in what's happening, talking to them, seeing what, you know, they would want to happen instead, why perhaps they're struggling. Is it simply kind of information overload? Could we think about how we're advising them differently? Is it, you know, the fact that they're just so busy with constituency work, or they've recently, you know, started an additional role, you know, in their party or something like that? Yeah, trying to understand why they're disengaged and doing our best to help with that. But ultimately, sometimes you've got to accept that you know, for us, perhaps, you know, committees and being a scrutiny officer, this is our life and we're really passionate about it. But for MPs, this is a fraction of their day-to-day work. So you've just got to accept sometimes that you know they're not going to be able to turn up to every meeting, and they're not always going to be wholly engaged in what you've got. But you know, by talking to them and listening to them, you can you know, adapt things to provide the best service that we can, I suppose.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I feel like I've been saying the same thing. It's, you know, it's a politically led environment, and it's kind of down to them really whether they're engaged or not. I mean, I guess you could maybe have a conversation with the chair if you notice that there might be particular reasons why someone isn't engaging. I mean, I think we talked a bit before about whether maybe someone's struggling with technology to access the papers, you know, something as basic as that. You know, yeah, as Matthew said, just need to talk to people and find out what's going on.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add to that. Same thoughts.
Okay.
And talk to their, sorry, and I was just going to say, and talk to their staff as well. I was just saying, and talk to their staff as well, because often it's, you know, the politician staff who do a lot of the reading and the work for them, and so talking to them and seeing how we best can serve them as a committee secretariat is also really important too.
There we are. Okay, well, I'm going to draw it to a close there by saying thank you so much, Faye, Francisca, Matthew. I think you've done an excellent job working through those questions, and they were tough questions, I thought, and I thought you did a really good job of working your way through them. So thank you once again for taking part in the fishbowl. I found it really, really useful. I've got a list of things that I've written down of different ideas that hopefully I'll be able to share in other places as well. So I personally have found it very useful, and I'm sure everybody else has found it useful as well. So thank you very much. Okay, so we're back for an unexpected extra time on the fishbowl. We had so many excellent questions in the chat that the fishes wanted just a bit more time to work their way through them, and I know people are going to be really keen to hear what the answers are. So some of our participants will have left, others are hanging around to listen, but either way we'll put this, obviously you'll be watching this on the video and you know that we've added it. So extra time from the fishes. Are you happy to take it away, fishes? There we are. Excellent. Away you go.
Okay, so I think the next question we were on is if your members also had another full-time job, how would you engage them in your review? So on that, I think what we do is speak to them and see what extra support we could give them, and offer them briefings and perhaps one-to-one advice sessions at a time that would suit them, which is probably easier in the virtual world where we don't have any restrictions about getting to and from offices and things. So yeah, just make sure we understood their needs and how we could best meet them.
I haven't had an experience of anyone who's had a full-time job, but an unusual feature of our system is that most of the members are also involved in government work as departmental members, they're called, and they have delegated responsibilities from the ministers. So yeah, we have a lot of problems with trying to organise meetings because members have so many competing priorities. And yeah, I mean, you just have to talk to them really. And again, I suppose it is a politically led thing. And if they're not engaged in their committee work because they're more interested in their other work, in our case, in their government work, then that's their prerogative. But I think just having conversations and trying to find out what is preventing them from engaging is important.
Yeah. Agreed. I don't think I have too much more to add there. Just, you know, speaking to them, speaking to their staff and seeing how best we can facilitate their scrutiny, despite obviously the challenges of them having another job. But obviously making sure that they declare interests if their other job is relevant to our scrutiny work, which is very important. So the next question is from David. How do you encourage members to ask effective, challenging follow-up questions? You know, challenging follow-up questions is a real skill, and I think it's something that newer members sometimes can struggle with unless they have a background in something like this, or in law, or formerly being a counsel involved in scrutiny in that way. We offer training. We've got training programs about kind of effective questioning and how to do those effective follow-up questions. And when we brief members, we'll often have our kind of headline question, question 5, and then our supplementary questions might be, if the minister says X, Y, Z, then ask this, and then or if the minister says ABC, then ask this. And so we've helped a little bit in signposting what they could ask as a kind of effective follow-up question. But it is it's a skill that some members can kind of learn, and some members have it, some members don't. So kind of training and briefing, but there's only so much we can do because we can't predict what witnesses and ministers are going to tell us.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think the training was really important at the start when you've got new members, because I think some new members aren't aware that they can ask a follow-up question, and it's about that confidence to do it. And as Matthew was saying, it's quite a skill, and we've sort of, as part of that training, we've got video footage from other committees of some sort of good examples of members asking follow-up questions. I think that helps just to demonstrate how powerful they can be. Yeah, trying to preempt what answers and include things in the brief. And also during the meeting, I mean, this is a bit harder in the virtual world, but we'd be sort of giving post-it notes to the chair to say, you might want to follow that up, but it conflicts with what we've heard elsewhere or whatever. And in the virtual world, we try and do that on email, or what people have WhatsApp groups and text. But we'll be watching and trying to help during the meeting as well.
Just wondering, so if the committee chair gives permission, the clerks can actually ask questions in our committees as well. Do any of you ever can you do that, or no? So,
definitely not. No, we're silent.
Occasionally, if there is a question that needs to be asked that isn't obviously overly political or contentious, then the clerks will actually ask it in our parliament. But that might not be appropriate in all parliamentary cultures or scrutiny cultures. Shall I go for the next one? How do you support members not to take the arguments of cabinet members or officers at face value and provide an appropriate level of critical challenge? Again, I suppose that's a kind of a skill that some members have and some members don't. I don't know if you can provide specific training on that, really. Again, I suppose it's about information in the brief and making sure that they're aware of what the actual landscape is and what is rhetoric and what is reality, and that sort of thing. Anyone?
Sorry, I was just going to say, very rarely you'll have something that's being said by a witness, be them kind of government or otherwise, that's just factually wrong. And in those cases, it's what Faye said, if passing a note saying actually this is the case, we should probably correct the record. But in terms of challenging what Secretary of State might say, it depends on the member in question. Some members are very motivated and will challenge almost everything that that a minister who comes before them will say. Others will kind of take it at face value. But yeah, presenting the information in the brief, having options for follow-up questions based on what we think that the witness might say. But again, it's a real skill.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. It's all down to the brief as well, I think, making sure members have got equipped with the information to make sure they can not take things at face value and have that challenge. Oh, the next one's for me. So the wash-up sessions I talked about earlier, would you invite the whole committee, or would it just be a conversation with the chair? That would be with the whole committee. So we allocate time at the end of every agenda to have a wash-up session where we can reflect on the evidence and on the brief, whether the briefing material was appropriate for members and helpful to them, flag up what questions they might want to ask witnesses coming in the following week, or if we've finished evidence gathering, help identify key issues for the committee's report. But we also have regular meetings with the chair as well, which involves an element of wash up to discuss those issues with him too, him or her. Yeah. Does either of you want to say anything about that?
No, I think you've got it all there.
Okay. So the next question then, supplementary questions. How do you organise these? We'd include supplementary questions in our briefing material.
Ditto for us. We also have a WhatsApp group with the members, and say if there's something that you know, the specialist or the member of staff who's organised that session thinks, oh, this is a really good time to ask X, Y, Z, we'll just pop that in the WhatsApp group saying it might be helpful if members could ask this, and similarly, passing notes to the chair or other members saying it could be really helpful for evidence, or this could be a good opportunity to really put the minister on the spot by asking X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that really. Same here. Ooh, next one's a good one. What does a successful meeting look like? Oh. Well, what does success mean in general, I suppose? One where the committee goes away happy and motivated. I don't know, have you got any particular thoughts on that?
Well, I always measure it by if we get to the sort of private wash up and the members say that was a really excellent session. And I think what they mean by that is that, the questions were answered by the witnesses and members felt that they got really useful insights and information. And that, I suppose that works on both sides. It's where we've had good witnesses who've been willing to engage constructively. And quite often that's down to the questions that are being asked as well. And members using those follow-up questions to get the information. So yeah, I think that's what I would say a successful meeting looks like. Everybody's happy and achieved the outcome and purpose of that session.
Yeah, I think Faye's covered most of it there. One thing that strikes me as well is having a really useful body of evidence coming from that session. So the witnesses have engaged and answered well, and they've said things which, if the committee want to, can be later drafted into the report and used to frame the recommendations that we'll provide. You'll often have some sessions, sometimes with the government or with others, where members might have felt that they've been able to ask the questions they like and subject the witnesses to really good scrutiny, but there's not actually too much useful has been said. So if we've had a session where we've got a really good body of evidence, we've heard something new, we've heard something that we can ultimately use to influence government policy, that's something. I mean, I should also say that I'm sure everyone's had these problems at the very start of the pandemic. A successful meeting was us, so we could see and hear every member who tried to join it. But hopefully we've moved past that now. We've provided them all with headsets, which I'm showcasing right now. So hopefully that solved that problem. The next one, and again, a really good question. How do you make recommendations smart? So I think I should talk a little bit about our process for drafting reports. So we send what's called a heads of report to the committee at a private meeting, which they discuss, which is essentially an essay plan. That's been developed by the lead member of staff and then consulted on by the rest of the team and seniors. If members agree on that, we then, as a staff body, draft the report. It gets sent to the head of our team. It gets sent to principal clerk, which is a level above. They'll review that, and all the way through, we're really conscious of the need to make things smart. So that kind of peer review and having that beautiful acronym SMART in our minds at all time is really helpful. But it is a tricky one, because to do smart recommendations, you need to know a hell of a lot about what you're making recommendations on. It's quite easy to make a wishy-washy recommendation. But to make something truly smart is actually really difficult. You need to know what's practical in terms of timeframes. You need to know the numbers. You need to know, the financial figures, the data. So I'm sorry, it's probably not a very good answer there, but we try our best in peer review and getting the views of others. We often will send our, get feedback from our draft reports to people in other committees or to colleagues in the House of Commons Library, which is the equivalent to the research service in the Senedd, so that those informed people who are in the same line of work as us can provide bit more constructive feedback on how we can, make them really succinct, because those are the ones that are most easy to measure, talking about impact 3 months later or whenever it is you look at it again.
Yeah, and just to add to that, finally, I think it's how you word your recommendations as well. Clear and concise. We've had feedback from Welsh Government at times saying, well, we don't know what you're saying. What is it you're recommending? And that makes it easier for them not to accept it or respond to it. So I think we've learned to try and make things clearer as well. And yeah, I think make sure you phrase them smart as well.
Yeah, and I suppose ultimately it goes back to trying to collect the evidence on which these recommendations are based and make sure that you have a proper evidence base for when you're making them, which is obviously the whole point of the process. When's the next one? Is there a next question?
I think we might have reached the end.
We might have done it.
I think you've done brilliantly well. You've got to the end. You've answered all of those questions, and I was really enjoying listening to that. I was nodding, and I was going, and I was doing that as well. So, if you want to know what a successful fishbowl audience member looks like, then that was me. I think I definitely enjoyed listening to all that, and I was making a few notes and a couple of things I might come back to a couple of you about afterwards as well. So, look forward to that. Excellent stuff. So just once again, thank you ever so much for the extra time. We haven't gone over too long actually, so it's only 12:05 here, so that's not too bad. But thank you, Faye.
Thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure.
And thank you for helping to sort it out as well and to set it up.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Francisca.
Well, thank you very much. I've learned a lot myself today. So
excellent stuff.
Again,
and thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and thanks everyone. Thanks, Faye and Francisca. Really interesting and very informative.
There we are. Brilliant stuff. And I'm going to close it there.